In the heart of Carrollton, Georgia, a suburban community known for its quiet streets and family-friendly neighborhoods, a story unfolded in early 2025 that no one could have anticipated. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted one another with warm smiles, where parents felt safe letting their children play outside, and where crime seemed like a distant concern. But in February of that year, this small community would become the epicenter of one of the most shocking and unsettling true crime stories in recent history. At the center of this chilling tale was 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick, a teenager who, on the surface, appeared to be just like any other girl her age. She attended school, spent time with friends, and, like millions of teenagers around the globe, she shared her life with the world through TikTok, the wildly popular social media platform. Sarah wasn't just another face scrolling through timelines, she had built a following. With her expressive videos, relatable teenage content, and striking online persona, she had carved out a place for herself in the digital spotlight. To her peers, she was more than just a classmate, she was an influencer in the making. But behind the glowing ring light and curated clips, there was another side of Sarah's life. A side tied to her family home, where she lived with her mother, 41-year-old Kristin Brock, her stepfather, 45-year-old James Brock, and her younger sister, just 6 years old. To outsiders, they looked like the picture of a blended family, stable, hardworking, and deeply rooted in the Carrollton community. Kristin, known for her warmth and dedication, was a devoted mother. James, respected in his circle, was described as a man who worked hard to provide for his family. Neighbors saw them as normal, everyday people. There was nothing on the surface that suggested the darkness that would soon engulf their lives. On the night of February 20, 2025, tragedy struck. Authorities were dispatched to the Brock residence after a chilling 911 call. What they found inside was something out of a nightmare. Both Kristin and James had been shot dead, executed in cold blood inside their own home. But the most haunting detail was not just the brutality of the crime, it was who discovered the bodies. The youngest member of the family, Sarah's 6-year-old sister, stumbled upon the unimaginable scene. A child barely old enough to understand the permanence of death, forced to witness something no child should ever have to see. Her frantic reaction and eventual call for help set in motion an investigation that would soon unravel a story stranger than fiction. News of the double murder spread quickly, not just in Carrollton, but across the nation. The victims weren't anonymous figures, they were tied to a teenager whose face and voice were already familiar to thousands online. The media instantly seized upon the headline, "TikTok Teen's Family Murdered." Overnight, the case became more than a local crime, it became a national sensation, amplified by the viral reach of social media. In those first days, the public saw Sarah as a victim too, a grieving daughter and stepsister who had just lost her family in the most violent way imaginable. She appeared devastated, mourning her parents publicly. She shared heartfelt posts, expressed her sorrow, and even delivered an emotional eulogy at her mother's funeral. To the outside world, she was a young girl shattered by tragedy, grappling with grief while under the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. But as investigators began their work, quietly combing through the evidence, inconsistencies started to emerge. Detectives noticed Sarah's behavior, both online and offline. Her social media activity didn't quite align with the grief of a broken-hearted daughter. Her interactions with others, especially her strange communications with true crime TikTok influencers, raised eyebrows. It was as if Sarah was not just living through the tragedy, she was scripting it, almost performing it. This was the beginning of a case that would blur the line between victim and suspect, between performance and reality. What started as a horrific double murder would soon twist into a story of alleged betrayal, manipulation, and chilling evidence, an unsettling reminder of how the digital age has changed not only how we live our lives, but also how we commit and uncover crimes. And so, the story begins, not just of a double murder, but of a teenager whose life on TikTok collided with a family tragedy, leaving behind questions that the world is still struggling to answer. The morning of February 20th, 2025, began like any other in the Brock household, or so it seemed. But as the sun rose over Carrollton, Georgia, a horrifying truth was waiting to be uncovered within the walls of a quiet suburban home. It was Sarah Grace Patrick's 6-year-old sister who first stumbled upon the scene. A child so young, so innocent, that she could barely comprehend what she was about to witness. What she found inside the family home would change her life forever and leave scars no amount of time could erase. Lying motionless were Kristin Brock, 41 years old, and James Brock, 45, her mother and stepfather. Both had been shot, their lives cut short in the most brutal and final way. The little girl's screams echoed through the house, piercing the silence and signaling that something terrible had happened. Neighbors later recalled hearing a commotion, but no one could have guessed the magnitude of what was unfolding. Somehow, despite her age and the shock she was in, the child managed to make contact with authorities. That 911 call marked the beginning of one of the most unsettling murder investigations Carrollton had ever seen. When police and emergency responders arrived, the scene they walked into was chilling. The Brock family home, once filled with the ordinary sounds of family life, had become a crime scene. Officers described the atmosphere as heavy, almost suffocating. Every step they took revealed more details of the violence that had unfolded within those walls. The bodies of Kristin and James showed signs of execution-style shootings. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate. For investigators, this instantly suggested that the crime was not the work of an intruder or burglar caught in the act. Instead, it felt targeted, intentional. Someone who knew this family had done this. The 6-year-old girl was escorted outside, trembling, confused, and traumatized. Detectives shielded her from the sight of her slain parents, but the damage had already been done. Her testimony, though delicate and incomplete given her age, would later become an important part of understanding what happened that night. As the investigation team carefully documented the scene, they noticed no signs of forced entry. The doors were locked, the windows intact. Nothing appeared stolen. This was not a robbery gone wrong, it was something far more personal. Bloodstains, shell casings, and the position of the bodies painted a grim picture. Kristin and James had been hunted inside their own home. The neighborhood quickly swarmed with flashing lights, crime scene tape, and murmurs from shocked residents. Carrollton was not used to this level of violence. Journalists began circling like vultures, eager to capture the first details of what would soon become a national headline. Amidst the chaos stood Sarah Grace Patrick. She had been the one to call 911 alongside her younger sister, playing the role of a grieving daughter. Officers on the scene noted her tears, her trembling hands, and her insistence that she had no idea who could have committed such a heinous act. At first glance, she looked like another victim of a senseless tragedy. But as one officer later put it, something about her felt off. The sheer brutality of the scene, combined with the eerie lack of forced entry, forced investigators to start asking hard questions right away. Who could have carried out such a calculated act? Why this family, and why in such a violent way? And, most disturbingly, was the killer someone from inside the home itself? The answers weren't clear that morning, but detectives knew one thing for certain: the crime scene at the Brock residence was not just the site of a double murder. It was the beginning of a case that would expose hidden lives, shocking evidence, and a teenager whose online persona would soon collide with unimaginable allegations. This wasn't just a murder investigation. It was the first step into a labyrinth of lies, digital trails, and family secrets that no one in Carrollton, or the wider world watching online, was prepared for. In the aftermath of the gruesome discovery inside the Brock family home, investigators wasted no time in piecing together the early clues. The scene had already made one fact brutally clear: this was not a random act of violence. There were no signs of forced entry, no stolen valuables, and no footprints of an intruder fleeing into the night. Everything about the killing suggested that whoever pulled the trigger was not only familiar with the house, but also deeply connected to the victims themselves. From the very beginning, detectives considered a chilling possibility: the killer had been inside the home all along. Police began their standard procedure: combing through the crime scene for forensic evidence. Every shell casing was photographed and collected. Fingerprints were lifted from door handles, furniture, and surfaces. Swabs for DNA were carefully taken. The meticulous process built what investigators would later describe as a mountain of evidence, but at this stage, it was evidence without a face. The first step was to establish a timeline. Witness interviews started with neighbors, family friends, and anyone who might have noticed unusual activity that night. But Carrollton was a quiet town, and in neighborhoods like this one, people rarely expected trouble. Few had seen anything suspicious. There were no reports of strangers lurking near the house, no cars speeding away, no noises that sounded like gunshots. For detectives, this silence spoke volumes. Attention naturally shifted inward, to the Brock family themselves. Kristin and James were, by all accounts, well liked. They weren't involved in criminal activity, they didn't owe money to dangerous people, and they weren't known to have enemies. By process of elimination, investigators began asking a more unsettling question: could the violence have come from within their own household? At the center of this question was 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick. In the days following the murders, Sarah played the role of the grieving daughter flawlessly. She attended vigils, posted heartfelt tributes on social media, and even delivered a tearful eulogy for her mother that left many in attendance crying with her. To the public eye, she was the image of heartbreak, a teenager devastated by an unthinkable loss. But detectives saw more than what was on the surface. They began noticing subtle red flags. Sarah's demeanor during questioning was inconsistent. At times she appeared distraught, breaking into tears, but at other times she seemed oddly detached, almost rehearsed in her answers. Her social media activity was also raising eyebrows. Just hours after her parents' deaths, she had already begun engaging with TikTok true crime creators, urging them to cover her family's case. The language she used, describing the potential coverage as a big hit, struck some investigators as chillingly out of place for a grieving daughter. Then there was her relationship with her mother and stepfather. While friends described Sarah as polite and cheerful, whispers began surfacing about tension inside the household. Arguments, disagreements over discipline, and conflicts typical of teenage life suddenly took on darker undertones. Was this normal family friction, or something far more sinister? Investigators couldn't ignore Sarah's growing presence online either. Her TikTok account, which had once been a place for lighthearted videos and teenage trends, was now a goldmine of clues. Old videos were re-examined for subtle hints of anger, sadness, or coded messages. Meanwhile, her new posts, filled with dramatic tributes and carefully crafted expressions of grief, began to feel less like authentic mourning and more like performance. Still, police had no smoking gun, at least not yet. Sarah remained on the list of potential witnesses and family members under routine investigation. To the public, she was still a victim. But behind closed doors, detectives were starting to treat her as something else, a possible suspect. And so, in the early days of the investigation, suspicion began to shift. Not outward, toward shadowy strangers or imagined enemies, but inward, toward a teenage girl who had built a life on performance, who seemed to know exactly how to play the part of a grieving daughter, and who, behind the bright lights of TikTok, might have been hiding a secret darker than anyone could fathom. The stage was being set for the first major turning point in the case. The question was no longer, who could have done this? It was becoming, chillingly, did Sarah do this? For weeks, investigators had been quietly building their case. They had the crime scene, they had the interviews, and they had the growing sense that something about 17-year-old Sarah Grace Patrick's behavior didn't quite add up. But suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed proof. And then, it came. The evidence that surfaced next would not only shatter Sarah's carefully crafted image as a grieving daughter, but also transform the entire investigation. Detectives would later describe it as bombshell evidence, the kind of breakthrough that flips a case upside down and leaves no room for doubt. It began with digital forensics. Investigators seized Sarah's phone, laptop, and access to her social media accounts. At first, they were searching for context, maybe messages with friends, emotional posts, or signs that she had known more about the crime than she was letting on. What they found went far beyond that. Hidden in her digital footprint were damning clues, late-night Google searches about firearms, disturbing queries about how investigators process crime scenes, and chilling notes about planning. But the most shocking discovery was tied to her own social media activity. Just days after the murders, Sarah had reached out directly to true crime TikTok influencers, asking them to cover her parents' deaths. She told them it would be a big hit, phrasing that unsettled not only the creators she contacted, but also detectives once they uncovered these messages. What kind of daughter, freshly mourning the loss of her mother and stepfather, would describe their brutal killings in terms of clicks and views? Even more damning was the funeral eulogy. Investigators scrutinized the video footage of Sarah standing before family and friends, delivering what appeared to be a heartfelt speech about her late mother. On the surface, it was touching and emotional. But when analyzed alongside her private digital activity, the performance took on a darker tone. Detectives began to view it less as grief and more as calculated theatrics. It was as if Sarah was consciously shaping a narrative, one where she was the tragic daughter, caught in a story that might one day trend on TikTok. Then came the physical evidence. Forensic analysis revealed details that couldn't be ignored. Gunshot residue, trace DNA, and inconsistencies in Sarah's account of the night began lining up in ways that pointed directly to her. While investigators have not disclosed every piece of forensic evidence publicly, prosecutors later hinted that the collection of materials was overwhelming, so much so that they described it as a mountain of proof. The case reached a turning point when police confronted Sarah with the evidence. According to reports, she initially denied everything, insisting she had nothing to do with the murders. But the sheer weight of the digital and physical trail left little room for escape. Investigators now had enough to do what once seemed unthinkable: charge the teenage TikTok star with the murders of her own mother and stepfather. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Just weeks earlier, Sarah had been seen as a heartbroken daughter, someone who had not only lost her family but also bravely shared her grief with the world online. Now, she was being painted as a suspect, someone accused of staging a performance while hiding the darkest of secrets. This bombshell evidence was not just proof of her alleged involvement, it was a revelation about the double life Sarah had been living. On one hand, she was a TikTok influencer, a teenager carefully curating her image for likes and followers. On the other, she was, according to prosecutors, a calculating murderer who thought she could outsmart investigators and control the narrative of her parents' deaths. The discovery of this evidence didn't just change the direction of the investigation, it redefined the entire case. Sarah was no longer a grieving victim in the eyes of the law. She was now the prime suspect in a crime so brutal and bizarre that it left even seasoned investigators stunned. The stage was set for the next chapter: legal proceedings, courtroom battles, and the unraveling of Sarah's public persona. When the investigation into the tragic Delphi murders began, police kept the list of potential suspects tightly under wraps. For years, the public was left in the dark, with whispers and online theories running rampant. But when the truth finally started to unfold, it shocked not only the local community but the entire nation. The suspects were not shadowy strangers from far away, they were men who walked among the very people grieving the loss of Abby and Libby. These were individuals who blended into the background of daily life, creating the chilling realization that a monster could hide in plain sight. What made this revelation even more disturbing was the level of betrayal it implied. To think that those responsible for such brutal crimes may have smiled at neighbors, stood in line at the grocery store, or even casually waved at the very families they would devastate, it's a haunting thought. Many in Delphi began to question everything they thought they knew about safety, trust, and the face of evil. The suspects' names brought waves of disbelief, anger, and confusion. How could someone so close, so seemingly ordinary, be capable of something so horrifying? And as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered disturbing patterns and connections. These weren't random attacks, they suggested planning, obsession, and a darkness that had been festering for far too long. The community had always suspected an outsider, someone who had swooped in and disappeared. But the suspects revealed a far scarier truth: sometimes, the danger doesn't come from strangers. Sometimes, it comes from people hiding right in front of us. The announcement of the suspects sent shockwaves through Delphi. Some residents felt relief that the police had finally named names, but for many others, it reopened old wounds. The sense of betrayal and loss of trust was overwhelming. Suddenly, this wasn't just a case about two girls who were taken too soon. It became a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask, it can look like anyone, live anywhere, and wait silently until the moment it strikes. As the investigation unfolded and the court prepared to try those accused of playing a role in the murders of Abigail Williams and Liberty German, the community's emotions boiled over into something bigger than just a local trial. What had started as a double murder case in Delphi, Indiana, quickly transformed into a nationwide conversation about justice, accountability, and the safety of young people in an increasingly digital world. When the alleged suspect Richard Allen was formally charged, the courtroom became the focus of intense media attention. News outlets from across the country camped outside the courthouse, capturing every moment. The hearings were packed, not only with journalists and reporters, but also with members of the Delphi community who had waited years for answers. Some wore T-shirts with the girls' pictures, a silent reminder to the world that Abby and Libby were not just victims in a headline, but daughters, sisters, and friends whose lives were cut short far too soon. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their evidence with a sense of gravity that matched the weight of the case. They pointed to digital footprints, witness statements, and chilling video clips captured by Libby on her phone. The defense, on the other hand, worked tirelessly to cast doubt, raising questions about evidence handling, possible contamination of crime scenes, and whether the accused was truly the man in the video. Every statement, every motion, and every legal argument was dissected not just by lawyers, but by millions of people following the trial online. And that is where the case took on another life, the court of public opinion. Social media platforms lit up with commentary. Hashtags about Abby and Libby trended as strangers from around the world demanded justice. Online communities analyzed every frame of the infamous "Down the Hill" video, every facial expression of the suspect, and every word spoken in court. Some users became so invested that they practically turned into digital detectives, sharing theories, timelines, and possible connections the authorities might have overlooked. Authorities often had to remind the public that speculation could harm the trial and delay justice for Abby and Libby. Still, the sheer scale of public support could not be ignored. Candlelight vigils, memorial walks, and community fundraisers became powerful reminders that even in the darkest times, people could come together to shine a light. The case had gone from a small-town tragedy to a worldwide movement, proving that justice is not only fought inside a courtroom, but also in the hearts and voices of people demanding accountability. In the end, the legal proceedings symbolized more than just a trial. They represented years of pain, frustration, and determination to see two innocent girls honored with justice. And the public outcry, relentless, emotional, and unwavering, ensured that no matter how long the legal process took, Abby and Libby's story would never fade into silence.